The history of China is somewhat exceptional among nations. The USA has been a major player on the world stage for, let's be generous, 250 years. Great Britain has been a major player on the world stage for, let's be generous, 500 years. The Mongol Empire only lasted 162 years, and Mongolia hasn't been a great power ever since. What I'm saying here is that most countries get one period of time as a great power, if they're lucky, and that period lasts maybe a few hundred years. China, on the other hand, is one of the few countries that managed to have several periods of time in the sun that lasted hundreds of years each. The Han Dynasty held several tributary states 100 years before the birth of Christ. In the 7th century, Chang'an, the capital city of the Tang Dynasty, was the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world. And when the Qing Dynasty achieved status of what was at the time the 4th largest empire ever, it was once again accepting tribute from places like Korea, Burma, Nepal and Vietnam. And after a century of humiliation, China got ready to retake its position on the world stage. And boy did it. They developed nuclear weapons. They took on the USA in direct conflict and pushed them back across Korea. They spent 70 years threatening to invade Taiwan and expanding their economic influence in China and Asia. And now, it looks like they might be able to topple the USA as global hegemon. So unlike almost any other country, China has managed to remain a great power on and off for over 2,000 years. In light of this, let's go over the history of China to learn more about what I would argue is the most geopolitically successful country ever. But first, just a quick guide to the citations of this video. Every time I want to cite a source, I will put the citation in the top right hand corner of the screen. The citation will include the name of the person who wrote the source, plus either the date the source was published or the page of the source that I am citing. So let's say I want to cite a source by a man named Patrick, and I'm citing specifically page 69 of that source, and the source was published in 2025. In the top right hand corner of the screen, I will put either Patrick page 69 or Patrick 2025. Then you can scroll down to the sources list that I placed into the description of this video and Control F, Patrick, so you can then find and read the source that I cited. If you understand that, thank you. Let's get into the video now. So the first known states in the history of China were in the 29th century BC. As always, the further back in history you go, the more murky the details are, and the less reliable the primary sources. The reason I bring up the primary sources from thousands of years ago typically aren't too reliable is because of the fact that the first kings of the first ever states in Chinese history apparently ruled for 100 years each, which is quite hard to believe. Not impossible, but it's more likely that these sources were simply fabricated in order to make these kings look more impressive than they were. And obviously China's not the only or worst offender of this, by the way. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, the first few kings of ancient Sumer apparently ruled for tens of thousands of years each in some cases. I think one guy supposedly ruled for 43,000 years? But anyway, about 800 years later, in 2070 BC, the Xia dynasty. The existence of the Xia dynasty has not yet been archaeologically proven, but in 1600 the Xia were overthrown by the Shang. The Shang used cowrie shells as currency, and they wrote on turtle shells and bones. When a Shang leader died, all of his slaves would be buried alive with him inside a 40-foot grave. And the reason for this was so he could continue to use them in the afterlife. Not even the sweet release of death would save you from enslavement in Shang China. Eventually, in 1046 BC, the Shang were overthrown because all of their slaves switched sides and transferred their allegiance to an enemy, allowing the Shang to be defeated in battle and forcing the Shang Emperor to kill himself by setting fire to his palace. Now, does anybody fancy a hot cup of Joe? Well, I hope so, because now we're being ruled by the Zhou dynasty, who took power in 1046 BC, and they ruled for hundreds of years, becoming the longest lasting dynasty in the history of China. And they were divided into two periods, the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou. The Western Zhou lasted from 1046 BC to 771 BC, and the Western Zhou developed sort of a feudal system in China, and they also had a lot of slavery. Slave owners had complete and total control over their slaves, to the point where they could kill their slaves if they wanted to. Fun fact, the Zhou's word for slave meant animal people. But in the 8th century BC, the Zhou suffered a stroke of extreme luck, because they were lucky enough to get a leader that could not help but work tirelessly day and night to do everything within his power to alienate absolutely everybody who supported him. For example, he would repeatedly sound the alarm and get the army ready to defend against an invasion, only for it to turn out that there was no invasion and actually he was just like schizophrenic or something. He also kicked out his queen, kicked out his son, and made one of his favourite concubines the queen instead, and made her child the prince, which angered absolutely everybody. And so, when somebody actually did invade, the concubine thing, combined with the fact that every other call he'd ever made to defend against an invasion had turned out to be literally crying wolf, nobody came to help him, and so he was killed in battle, as was his son. His concubine was captured. His remaining nobles fled across the river to establish a new government in their alternate capital. This began the period of the Eastern Zhou, which lasted from 771 BC to 256 BC. But after that, the Zhou never really had any power. The local warlords were the ones who were really in control, and they only paid lip service to serving the Zhou. Still, the warlord states of the Eastern Zhou did manage to advance society a lot. Grain began to be produced in higher and higher quantities, allowing for there to be a surplus of food. And because there was more grain and everybody had enough food, there was no reason to fight each other anymore, and so there was peace on Earth. Just kidding! No, what actually happened was the fact that there was more grain allowed people to create the first standing armies in the history of China. And war technology even began to develop even more. They invented the crossbow, the chopstick. The chopstick isn't really a war technology, but it is something they invented. So they invented the crossbow, and they also started riding horses a lot more in war, and that meant that many soldiers stopped wearing really long skirts and started wearing trousers instead, because it's quite impractical to ride a horse while wearing a skirt. However, around this time, the Axial Age began. The Axial Age was a period from 800 to 200 BC when philosophy took off. Prior to this point in history, there was very little evidence of humans being reflective upon themselves and introspective. It probably happened, but they didn't really write any of it down. But suddenly, in about 800 BC, civilizations across the world began writing so much philosophy. You had Palestine, Persia, India, China, Greece getting on the act. You had Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Socrates, Confucius. Almost all the philosophical ideas that we still use to this day were coined during the Axial Age. For example, did you know Sun Tzu, Confucius, Pythagoras, and the Buddha were all alive at roughly the same time? Meaning that it was technically possible for all four of those men to be in the same room. And of course, China played a very big role in the Axial Age, with people like Confucius, for instance. Some scholars argue the Axial Age isn't real. For example, it has been pointed out that in Greece and China, the Axial Age didn't start until 300 years after Jaspers said that it started. So why am I talking about Chinese philosophy so much? Well, partly because I think it's interesting how similar some of our ideas are to people really far in the past, but also because one of the ideas that sprung up during the 100 schools of thought period of China was the legalist philosophy. The legalists believed that human nature was inherently evil, and lots of people believed that in ancient China. That wasn't inherently special. However, different people prescribed a different solution to fix the problem. And the legalists believed that the only solution was an authoritarian, militaristic state to keep the people in line and suppress the evil desires of humanity. And in 363 BC, a legalist was made ruler of the Qin state. And he implemented his legalist philosophy by turning the Qin into a militaristic state. Everybody had to work in weaving or agriculture, and if you tried to get a different job or work less, you would be enslaved. The only way to get freedom from forced labour was to overproduce. This made the Qin so powerful that they were able to conquer all of China and establish the first ever imperial dynasty in the history of the country. Ancient China was at an end. Imperial China was just beginning. They abolished feudalism and hereditary rule. Instead of bloodline deciding who got promoted, loyalty and skill decided whether or not the Qin would have you in charge of something. Hundreds of thousands of families from the defeated states in China were moved to the Qin capital city so an eye could be kept on them. The ownership of weapons was made illegal. Books were burned and education was strictly controlled by the state. But in 210 BC, the emperor of the Qin state died, and his son, Fusu, was set to take the reins. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister of the Qin, Li Si, didn't really like Fusu, and the reason for that was because Fusu was not a legalist. He disagreed with all the book burnings that his father had done, and so Li Si realised that he could not let Fusu become in charge of the Qin. And so, he and the head eunuch in the palace implemented the age-old political strategy of tell your political opponents to kill themselves. They forged, the late emperor's will so that Fusu's younger brother was actually supposed to be in charge of China, and Fusu had been ordered to kill himself because that's something the emperor could order you to do at the time. And what do you know? It worked! Some people questioned the veracity of this document, but Fusu said, who would lie about a thing like that? And he killed himself. His younger brother was made the Emperor of China. You do have to wonder what the relationship was like between Fusu and his father, that if he received a letter from his father telling him to kill himself, when a lot of people would like him dead, Fusu still thought that it was more likely that his father genuinely wanted him to kill himself than just somebody was trying to get him dead. You just gotta wonder, it must not have been a very nice household. But either way, Li Si, the Prime Minister, would get executed by Zhao Gao, the head eunuch who had helped Li Si forge the letter. Zhao Gao became the de facto ruler of China. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings of the new emperor, even convincing the new emperor never ever to speak to anybody else except himself. Of course, it wouldn't do Zhao Gao much good, because tyranny lives on borrowed time. You see, Zhao Gao ramped up his oppression of the Chinese people. Hundreds of thousands were transferred to the border to act as soldiers to guard the territory against invaders. But unfortunately, if a unit of soldiers was late to the border, even by a few days, for any reason whatsoever, they would all be executed. Even if the weather was bad, that wasn't an excuse. If the soldiers had a dentist appointment, that wasn't an excuse. But the issue with that is that if a group of soldiers realises that they're going to be late, then they have exactly two options. They can turn themselves in and all die horribly, or start a rebellion. And of course, the best way to guarantee a revolution is to give the people nothing left to lose. To borrow a popular saying, it is better to die trying to take them down than die giving them what they want. And what do you know? That's exactly what happened. In August or September, historians aren't really sure, of 209 BC, a unit of soldiers met extremely terrible weather on their way to the border. They got held up, and they realised they weren't gonna be on time. And so, two of their leaders decided to start a rebellion. They got 10,000 men on their side. It didn't last long though. In January of 208 BC, they were defeated. Of course, it wouldn't do the Qin much good though. In 206 BC, the Han Dynasty overthrew the Qin, giving the Qin a grand total of 15 years in power, making them arguably the shortest dynasty and most tyrannical dynasty in the history of China. Now, the Han Dynasty actually brought China into a bit of a golden age. They were a lot less oppressive than the Qin. Sure, most people still had to engage in forced labour, however, the Han would bribe people to be productive by bribing them with short breaks in their forced labour. For example, if you had a baby, that would give you a 2-year break from forced labour as maternity leave. Under the Han Dynasty, economic growth and technological advancement increased. During the Han Dynasty, the records of the Grand Historian were published, which is the first book in human history which attempted to give a complete history of China. During the Han Dynasty, paper was invented, making reading material far more accessible to so many people. The rudder was invented, which made it a lot easier to, sail and do boating stuff with boats. Negative numbers were invented. People in the Han Dynasty also invented anesthesia. They invented pi. They invented a seismometer, which could detect earthquakes from thousands of miles away. They invented something called an armillary sphere, and they were the first people to theorise that moonlight was reflected off the sun. The Han Dynasty suffered a short break when the Jin took control, but the Han very quickly took back power. The Han Dynasty even knew about the existence of the Roman Empire, and they even sent emissaries to communicate with the Roman Empire, but the emissaries never made it. But of course, Roman emissaries in 166 AD did actually make it to the Chinese capital city to communicate with China. And then there was another warlord period that lasted 369 years. You've probably seen the oversimplified video on this, so you know vaguely what happens. Basically, China fractured into dozens of smaller warlord states, which eventually united into 3 warlord states, and the one in the north conquered the ones in the south, creating the Jin Dynasty. But the Jin were never able to establish a proper central authority over all of China, and there were definitely civil wars. But eventually the Jin collapsed and China split up once again into 2 halves. Now, while there were 16 whole kingdoms in the north, Chinese civilization over there seemed a thing of the past. Bandits and famine ran rampant, and local villages could not trust the higher government to defend them. All the villages had to fund and create their own defence forces. This came to an end when, in the 5th century, the Tuaba immigrants came in from Mongolia and established the Northern Wei dynasty, which lasted from 439 to 534 AD. Now, the south was slightly less unstable than the north, and so there was a mass migration to the south, boosting the southern economy and allowing it to compete with the northern one for the first time in history. The south went through 4 different dynasties between 420 and 589, largely ruled by generals who seized power, held it for a few decades, but then failed to pass it on to a successor. This period of separation came to an end when, in 589 AD, 369 years after the Han Dynasty had collapsed, the Sui Dynasty took control of all of China. It's spelled like this, but apparently you pronounce it Sui. The Sui Dynasty had to fund their wars in Korea and their infrastructure projects, and to do that, they levied heavy taxes on the peasants, which caused them to revolt, resulting in the Sui Dynasty getting replaced by the Tang Dynasty. The leaders of the Tang Dynasty brought heavy economic growth to the country, and at one point they even managed to expand to gain all of this territory, which is quite impressive. Also, here's a fun fact. Sometime before the Sui Dynasty took control of China, a Chinese mathematician calculated pi to 8 digits, which was at the time the most anybody had ever calculated pi. He actually held the record for the most precise calculation of pi in human history for 900 years after that. During the 369 years between the Han Dynasty and the Sui Dynasty, Confucianism had seen a decline. Buddhism and Taoism had seen an increase, and the Tang were not going to let that stand. So, they restored the policies of Confucianism, and in 841 AD, they launched a wave of suppression against Buddhism. Many Buddhist schools of thought were completely annihilated and wiped out forever because of this wave of suppression. That said, the Tang Dynasty was definitely a golden age in Chinese history, especially compared to the last few hundred years of utter chaos. The Tang Dynasty developed a system which ended up being quite efficient, where all the land was technically owned by the government. However, they would distribute it out to certain people. Everybody had a right to some land, even slaves, and once they died it would be returned to the government and then reassigned. Fun fact, in 4,000 years of Chinese history, only one woman has ever managed to become leader of the Chinese state. Empress Wu Zetian officially ruled China for 15 years. However, even prior to that, she had been functionally pulling the strings behind various male emperors of China, like her sons and her husband, for instance. In 705 AD, she was overthrown in a coup at the age of 80 years old, and a year later, she died. Of course, no dynasty lasts forever. In the 9th century, there were a bunch of rebellions against the Tang, and while the Tang did manage to put down a lot of those rebellions, to do so, they had to give increasingly more power to the military governors in the regions, who ended up just doing whatever they wanted without caring what the Tang government thought. Eventually, there was one too many rebellions, and in 1907, the Tang dynasty came to an end, and China shattered. Eventually, in 960, Emperor Taizu installed the Song dynasty over all of China. One of the first things he did after taking the capital city was he bribed all of his generals to retire with generous pensions, and what that did was guarantee that with all his generals gone, there was nobody who could possibly overthrow him. That said, they did fail to retake their land from Khitan, and after a series of defeats, they ended up having to pay tribute to the Xia and the Khitan in the north. Of course, it wasn't all bad. I mean, they invented gunpowder, I guess that's not a good thing. Millions of people have been killed by gunpowder. By 1100 AD, the population of China was 100 million. There was actually a rebellion in Khitan, and the Song allied with those rebels to help get rid of Khitan. But eventually, the rebels turned on the Song and defeated them as well. The Song also invented paper money, and during the time of the Song dynasty, rice finally became a staple of the Chinese diet. The Song established the first permanent navy in China, a navy which won them a series of great victories against their enemies. Of course, all dynasties decline eventually. Poverty began to increase in the Song dynasty, and many babies had to be drowned at birth because the parents simply couldn't afford to feed them. And to make matters worse, the Mongol Empire came along. The Jin dynasty had taken control of the north, but not for much longer. The Mongol Empire came in between 1212 and 1213 AD and sacked more than 90 cities in China, and in 1215, they finally stormed the Jin capital city. China gradually fell over the course of the 13th century until eventually all of China was under their control. In China, the Mongols established a police state and a strict social hierarchy. At the top, you had the Mongols themselves. Below that, you had anybody who wasn't Chinese. In fact, if you weren't Chinese and you went to China at the time, you had a very good chance of getting a high-ranking government job. Even Marco Polo managed to get a job, high-ranking. Below them were the northern Chinese, followed by the southern Chinese right at the bottom. And when I say the Mongols set up a police state in China, I mean it. Weapons were so heavily regulated that you were only allowed to have one vegetable knife per 10 households. And you would have people enforcing that, by the way. Chinese people were not allowed to engage in any pastime or sport that could potentially increase their fighting capabilities. So throughout the history of China, there have been several times where the population has increased and then rapidly decreased. So for example, in the late Han, there was a census which estimated the population of China at 50 million. But during the Jin dynasty, another census, which was admittedly less comprehensive, estimated the population at 16 million. Now once again, the Jin census wasn't as good, so it was going to miss a lot of people out. However, it goes to show that the Chinese population had decreased by millions. And this happened again during the time of the Mongol Empire. In 1207, the population of China was 165 million, if you add up all the dynasties. But due to the Mongols' extremely oppressive policies and all the wars that China had fought against the Mongols, by 1290, the population was down to 60 million. And throughout the 14th century, the population remained at about 60 million. The Mongols established the Yuan dynasty over China. However, in 1368, a man named Emperor Hongwu declared the Ming dynasty. Hongwu had joined a rebel cell trying to overthrow the Mongol Empire at a very young age. This was one of several rebel groups working against the Mongols, and he gradually worked his way up through the ranks until he became in charge of one of them. And the Mongols did not try to resist. They retreated north into Mongolia, and the Ming were in control of China. The Middle Kingdom was independent. Anyway, basically what happened after that was the Ming would, in the 1600s, be overthrown by the Qing dynasty, and the Qing would expand Chinese territory to the largest it had ever been. Eventually, the Qing would suffer a century of humiliation, and in 1912, they'd be overthrown by a republic, and you probably know the rest of it. So yeah, that's basically the history of China. Thanks for watching.